Cochise was no ordinary warrior. He was an embodiment of an intractable problem. Rather than raising conventional armies, he sowed seeds of profound uncertainty. He did not fortify cities or strongholds, instead melting into the embrace of the mountains. For the United States Army, he was not a chief to be directly confronted, but rather a war lacking any definable battlefield. For over a decade, Cochise masterfully transformed the vast deserts of the Southwest into an insidious weapon, striking with swift precision, vanishing without a trace, and compelling an empire to slowly bleed without ever perceiving the elusive hand that inflicted its wounds. Here on Fragments of History, we delve into the lives of those individuals whom history itself could not truly contain. If you appreciate historical storytelling presented with a cinematic flair, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a like to support this unique project. The Chiricahua Apache did not recognize artificial borders or property lines. Their loyalties lay with the mountains, the essential water sources, and the predictable rhythm of the changing seasons. Their ancestral homeland stretched across what would later be demarcated as Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Yet, these imposed names held no meaning for a people who had thrived there for generations before any maps presumed to define their existence. The land itself served as a formidable fortress. Jagged mountain ranges dramatically rose from the desert floors, resembling colossal, broken teeth. Deep, winding canyons concealed vital springs, representing the crucial difference between life and death. From rocky peaks, they commanded an unobstructed view for miles in every direction. This was not a territory that passively invited settlement. It relentlessly demanded profound respect, ancestral memory, and constant, rigorous adaptation. The Chiricahua moved with deliberate purpose, never randomly. They possessed an intimate knowledge of where water could be found and preserved during the driest months. They understood precisely which canyons offered routes of escape and which would inevitably become perilous traps. They were skilled in reading the ground for signs of game, the approach of strangers, and impending weather changes, details utterly invisible to outsiders. Every child absorbed this vital geography, not from paper maps, but by traversing it repeatedly until the land's contours and secrets were etched into their very bodies. They lived in small, highly mobile groups, not due to any lack of societal structure, but because the harsh desert environment unforgivingly punished permanence. Families typically clustered into local bands, perhaps numbering 50 to 100 individuals, guided by men whose authority derived solely from their proven competence, a quality that was continuously tested. These groups would converge for significant ceremonies or large-scale raids, only to disperse again into the vastness of stone and distance. Flexibility, for the Chiricahua, was not a mere preference, it was an absolute prerequisite for survival. Their economy revolved around what others would later term subsistence: hunting, gathering, and raiding. Mescal was meticulously harvested. Deer and antelope provided essential sustenance. Wild plants, often overlooked by outsiders, were expertly collected. And in their worldview, raiding was not considered theft. It was perceived as an act of rebalancing. Mexican ranches possessed horses and cattle, which Apache families also needed. To take them was simply to rectify an imbalance that the world, in their eyes, had already created. This fundamental logic perpetuated a permanent state of low-intensity conflict along the frontier. Mexican settlements would retaliate, and Apache groups would invariably counter. The cycle relentlessly tightened and repeated across generations. Neither side truly sought total conquest, both accepting that conflict was an inherent, persistent feature of their shared landscape. Young men proved their mettle in these raids, and leaders emerged only if they demonstrated the ability to bring their warriors home alive, with valuable goods, necessary horses, and their dignity firmly intact. Warfare was not a distinct, separate aspect of Chiricahua life, it was deeply interwoven into its very fabric. Boys began their training as soon as they could proficiently hold a bow. They learned to move through the terrain without making a sound, to meticulously track, and to choose ground that inherently favored them while punishing any pursuit. Endurance was meticulously cultivated through a brutal and unyielding discipline, traversing countless miles in the scorching summer heat, enduring hunger and thirst, lessons etched into their very muscles, for the unforgiving land would grant no quarter to weakness. However, Apache warfare was not designed for conventional set-piece battles or the static defense of territory. Its essence lay in rapid contact and swift disappearance, striking fiercely where the enemy was most exposed, seizing what was necessary, and dissolving seamlessly before any coherent retaliation could be organized. Speed was paramount, far outweighing numbers. The intimate knowledge of the terrain held more significance than the power of weapons. A small, agile group intimately familiar with the land could effectively break a much larger, unfamiliar force without ever allowing that force to engage on its own terms. The mountains provided everything essential for their way of life: defense, concealment, water, game, and a profound spiritual gravity that shaped their very understanding of themselves. High peaks were sacred places where warriors sought profound visions and power. Deep canyons concealed trails and hideouts that pursuers would never discover. The intricate patterns of rocks and ridges fractured tracks into nothingness, and the arid desert air swiftly erased mistakes, unless one had been raised with the innate ability to perceive what others could not. To European and American observers, the Chiricahua's lack of a written language, permanent architecture, or centralized government appeared to be a sign of primitive absence. In stark reality, it represented an extraordinary precision, a highly sophisticated adaptation to a world that ruthlessly punished rigidity. Why construct something that the desert could trap you within? Why enshrine leadership into a fixed hierarchy when the most capable individual today might not be the most effective leader tomorrow? Authority was never inherited. It was meticulously earned and could swiftly evaporate the moment it ceased to prove its ongoing efficacy. Their spiritual life carried the same practical weight and immediate relevance. Power flowed from the land, from animals, and from natural forces that demanded profound respect rather than mere possession. Medicine men conducted ceremonies designed to strengthen hunts and raids, and warriors carried protective objects. Yet there was no sharp, clean line separating the sacred from the ordinary. Every decision carried consequences in both spiritual and physical realms. Every ritual served a tangible purpose in the physical world. While different clans and bands maintained their own distinct customs and territorial ranges, kinship ties intricately connected them all. The Chiricahua belonged to a broader Apache world that encompassed Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Western Apache groups. They could understand one another, occasionally intermarried, and sometimes engaged in conflict. However, independence remained the guiding rule, with groups gathering only when mutual need explicitly demanded it. This was not a world passively waiting to be shaped by an external power. It was already complete, already functional, and already hardened by centuries of relentless pressure. The Apache had stoically endured Spanish colonization and ultimately survived it. They had adapted to Mexican rule and its attendant violence. They had observed trappers and traders passing through, learning how to strategically utilize them, bargain with them, or simply avoid them. They had learned, time and again, that empires merely changed names but invariably harbored the same relentless hunger for control. By the 1850s, however, something fundamentally different was encroaching upon the desert. These were not mere traders seeking passage, nor missionaries who could be conveniently ignored, nor small numbers of soldiers who could be effectively avoided. The Americans were arriving with a clear intent to stay, carving roads into ancient corridors, erecting forts, and claiming vast tracts of land that had never legitimately been theirs to appropriate. From their mountain vantage points, the Apache watched. They had encountered invaders before. The Spanish had relentlessly tried for generations and ultimately failed. The Mexicans had offered bounties for Apache scalps and achieved nothing but a surge in retaliatory raids. These new Americans appeared confident, exceptionally well armed, highly organized, and numerically superior. But confidence, Cochise knew, meant nothing in a country that could starve an entire column without a single shot being fired. Arms were utterly useless if one could not locate an elusive enemy. Numbers were irrelevant if water sources could be denied and vital supply lines severed. Among the Chiricahua, one leader began to emerge who profoundly understood the critical difference between merely fighting a nation and systematically eroding its certainty. He grasped that the homeland was not simply a place to defend, It was a potent weapon in itself. His name was Cochise, and he was about to impart a harsh lesson to an empire. Some wars cannot truly be won, only endured. Cochise was born around 1805 into a world already defined by conflict. It was not the total war of empires, but the constant, grinding struggle that intrinsically framed Apache existence. His childhood was not rooted in a single, stable location. It was spent in perpetual motion through a landscape that ruthlessly claimed the careless and richly rewarded the observant. Apache children were not afforded the luxury of an extended innocence. As soon as Cochise could walk with steady resolve, he was learning to interpret disturbed earth and broken vegetation with the same fluency others used to read written words. By the age of 5, he could identify a vast array of edible plants and knew precisely which water sources were safe to drink from. Survival was his fundamental education. The lessons were immediate, and the penalty for failure was unequivocally real. His father was a respected leader among the Chokanan band of the Chiricahua. Yet leadership was not inherited like a title. It was meticulously earned and could be lost if proven insufficient. Cochise grew up intently observing how critical decisions were made, how his father judiciously measured risk, read intentions, and precisely judged when to engage in battle and when to pursue dialogue. Nothing was delivered as formal instruction. It was absorbed through attentive listening, keen observation, and being present when the profound consequences of those decisions inevitably arrived. Physical training commenced early in life and never softened with age. Boys would run for miles at dawn, carrying water in their mouths that they dared not swallow, thereby learning simultaneous control and rigorous discipline. They practiced with bows until their fingers were raw and split. They learned to move through dense brush without making a sound, to step precisely where branches would not snap, and to pass through places that would expose anyone untrained. Sometimes they went without food for days, not as an act of drama, but to gain a deep, visceral understanding of how the body functions when stripped down to its most basic needs. But the training was never solely physical. Cochise learned to perceive terrain as an intrinsic weapon, identifying optimal locations for an ambush, spots where pursuit would inevitably break apart, which routes offered swift escape, and which would morph into deadly traps. He mastered the art of utilizing the sun and shadows as perfect cover. He cultivated patience, developing the ability to remain utterly motionless for hours until the opportune moment arose. And he learned the most arduous lesson of all, that survival often necessitated doing nothing, even when instinct powerfully demanded immediate action. War was not an event that simply arrived and then departed. It was a constant, pervasive presence. Mexican soldiers regularly raided Apache camps, and Apache warriors swiftly retaliated against Mexican settlements. Other Apache bands occasionally competed for vital resources and prime hunting grounds. This cycle of violence continually reshaped alliances, shifted territorial boundaries, and rigorously tested reputations. It was the crucible in which young men proved their worth, how leaders maintained their authority, and how the delicate balance between groups was renegotiated time and again. Cochise joined his first raid as a teenager, not yet as a frontline fighter, but as a horse handler, a role typically assigned to boys who had not yet earned their place in direct combat. He meticulously observed how experienced warriors moved and communicated without uttering a single word. He watched how they struck with lightning speed, then vanished before the enemy could consolidate into anything dangerous. He learned that successful raids were not built on courage alone. They were founded on meticulous planning, rigorous discipline, and the absolute willingness to abandon a failing plan without the slightest hesitation. His first kill occurred during a skirmish with Mexican soldiers. The precise details were never recorded, lost to an oral tradition that did not elevate individual acts of violence into legend. What truly mattered was the threshold it marked. Cochise had transitioned from a boy to a warrior. He could now speak in tribal councils, participate fully, and begin the arduous process of building the reputation that would define the remainder of his life. Reputation was everything. A man's worth was not measured by his possessions, which could be lost, traded, or given away, but by his demonstrated ability to perform under intense pressure. Could he meticulously track game when others found nothing? Could he reliably bring a raiding party home alive and successful? Did his judgment remain steadfast when fear and chaos threatened to shatter it? These were the fundamental questions that determined who would lead and who would follow. Cochise proved unusually adept at discerning complex situations. While many young warriors impulsively chased glory through reckless acts, he focused intently on tangible outcomes. He rigorously studied why some raids succeeded and why others catastrophically collapsed. He noticed that the most effective leaders were not necessarily the most aggressive, but rather those who profoundly understood timing, when to strike, when to judiciously withdraw, and when to entirely refuse a fight. He learned to suppress his ego in favor of achieving tangible results. By his mid-20s, he was already leading his own raiding parties. Warriors followed him not because of his bloodline, but because they consistently returned alive and successful from his expeditions. His raids into Mexico were meticulously calculated, targets were thoroughly scouted, and escape routes were chosen with precision before the first move was even contemplated. He did not commit to fights where the odds were uncertain. This was not hesitation, but the precise mathematics of survival. His authority grew in the only way it truly could in Apache life: organically. There was no coronation, no title bestowed by a higher power. Leadership was fluid, earned. Men led because others consciously chose to follow. Cochise led because his decisions consistently endured repeated testing in situations where a single mistake could mean certain death. And he began to notice a subtle yet significant shift beyond the familiar pattern of raids and reprisals. The Mexicans, while adversaries, were known enemies. Their tactics were predictable, their weaknesses understood. The Americans arriving from the east, however, represented something fundamentally different, better armed, far more organized, and demonstrably intent on permanent settlement rather than perpetuating the old cycle of raid and counter-raid. Some Apache leaders dismissed the Americans, while others optimistically assumed accommodation was possible, believing that trading relationships could continue as they had with trappers and earlier traders. Cochise, in contrast, watched and spoke little. He had learned the inherent danger of early conclusions. It was always better to observe, to meticulously gather information, and to fully comprehend what these new arrivals truly wanted before deciding how best to confront them. By the late 1850s, he was unequivocally among the most respected leaders of the Chiricahua. Not the oldest, nor necessarily the most traditional, but undeniably the man whose tactical judgment carried immense weight. When bands converged for ceremonies or major raids, men listened intently when he spoke, not because he held formal authority, but because his words were consistently backed by years of decisions that had demonstrably kept his people alive. He had married, he had children, and he carried the profound obligations that Apache life demanded. Yet, his reputation ultimately rested on what he could actually do: track enemies across ground that appeared utterly untouched, meticulously plan raids that yielded maximum resources with minimum risk, and decipher intentions through subtle signs that others dismissed as insignificant. What made Cochise truly dangerous was not mere ferocity, though many Apache warriors were indeed fierce. It was his unparalleled ability to think far beyond the immediate moment. He grasped that warfare was not solely about direct clashes, but about subtly shaping conditions until the enemy exhausted itself, relentlessly chasing objectives it could never truly secure. He was learning to transform the very landscape into an instrument of war, to make the desert an active ally that punished anyone who dared to move through it blindly. For years, this strategic approach had proven sufficient. Mexico raided Apache territory, and the Apache raided back in kind. There were temporary truces, fleeting understandings, followed inevitably by renewed violence. When circumstances shifted, either side anticipated permanent victory. War was simply the prevailing state of affairs. But in 1861, an event occurred that would fundamentally reshape everything, transforming Cochise from a respected war leader into the architect of a protracted conflict that would consume the Southwest for more than a decade. A young Army second lieutenant, arrogant and deeply inexperienced, would act on false information compounded by profound cultural ignorance, a single, ill-fated decision that would shatter what little diplomacy still precariously existed. And Cochise, who had dedicated his entire life to mastering survival in impossible situations, was about to demonstrate to the United States Army precisely what a single, resolute leader, supported by the formidable desert, could achieve. The Americans arrived not as transient raiders, but as permanent settlers. They diligently constructed stage stations along the crucial routes leading to California. They established military posts to safeguard the vulnerable wagon trains. They meticulously surveyed land and arbitrarily drew property lines across vast territories that the Apache had never conceived of as ownable. Each fort, each road, each permanent structure conveyed the same unmistakable message: the old patterns of life and land use would no longer be tolerated. For a period, an uneasy coexistence precariously held. The Apache cautiously avoided direct conflict with American troops, preferring to focus their raids on Mexican targets, as had long been their practice. American authorities, thinly spread across immense distances, wisely preferred a fragile peace over engaging in another war they were ill-equipped to properly supply. Trade sporadically occurred, and agreements were articulated, but the words carried vastly different meanings for each side. Cochise, now in his 50s and recognized as the principal chief of the Chokanin, navigated this new and complex reality with utmost care. He maintained cautious relations with certain traders and military men, understanding the strategic value of American goods, metal, cloth, weapons, items that could fortify families in a harsh and demanding country. Yet, he also understood what mattered far more: American expansion was not a temporary interruption, it was a deliberate, long-term plan. The Mexicans possessed towns and ranches, but vast stretches of land still remained quintessential Apache country. The Americans, however, moved differently. Where they went, roads inexorably followed, then settlements, then more roads connecting even more settlements. This pattern suggested not peaceful coexistence, but systematic replacement, a future with no conceivable space for a people who moved fluidly with the seasons and steadfastly refused to recognize arbitrary property boundaries. The discovery of gold rapidly accelerated everything. Miners poured into Apache territory, demonstrating no interest in treaties and no respect for traditional land use. They frequently shot Apache people they encountered, fouled essential water sources, and ruthlessly extracted whatever they desired from the land as if nothing indigenous lived there. And when Apache warriors inevitably retaliated, newspapers in distant cities sensationalized Indian massacres, without ever acknowledging the profound intrusions that had relentlessly triggered them. Local conflicts proliferated, until the original cause and blame blurred into a fog of rumor and speculation. A rancher's cattle vanished. Was it an Apache raid or mere theft? A party of miners was ambushed. An Apache attack or Mexican bandits? An Apache camp was fired upon. Legitimate military action or vigilante violence? In the immense cultural gulf between these two colliding worlds, truth became agonizingly difficult to prove and disturbingly easy to weaponize. Kidnapping had long been an unfortunate part of the Southwest's brutal frontier economy. Mexicans took Apache children and sold them into servitude, while Apache raiders took Mexican children for ransom, trade, or adoption. It was a practice understood, though never acceptable or clean, yet grimly familiar within the region's ongoing violence. Americans, however, did not comprehend these deeply ingrained patterns. Their outrage, while seemingly moral, paradoxically coincided with their own relentless displacement of indigenous populations. In early 1861, a rancher named John Ward reported that raiders had attacked his ranch, stolen cattle, and abducted his stepson, Felix Ward, a boy of half Mexican, half Irish heritage. Ward promptly blamed Cochise, despite having no concrete proof. But the accusation traveled faster than facts, quickly reaching military authorities at Fort Buchanan, where officers promptly decided that decisive action was imperative to demonstrate American control. Second Lieutenant George Bascom, a 26-year-old, newly trained officer, brimming with certainty in his authority, was given a detachment and orders to recover the boy and punish those responsible. He possessed no experience with Apache diplomacy, no understanding of the intricate divisions between their bands, and no real sense of how swiftly one catastrophic mistake could transform a precarious frontier into an all-consuming war zone. On February 4, 1861, Bascom invited Cochise to a meeting at Apache Pass, a critical water source and vital corridor utilized by both sides. Cochise arrived peacefully, bringing his brother, 2 nephews, a woman, and 2 children, an unspoken testament that he believed this was safe ground for genuine negotiation. Bascom immediately accused Cochise of abducting Felix Ward. Cochise truthfully denied the accusation, as it would later be definitively understood. The raid had been carried out by Western Apache, not his Chiricahua band. He offered to assist in locating the boy and negotiating his return, a familiar solution, the kind of mediation that had successfully diffused similar crises in the past. Bascom, however, refused to accept it. He abruptly announced that Cochise and his accompanying family members would be held hostage until the boy was returned. Orders were swiftly given, and soldiers moved to arrest them. Cochise, seated near the tent wall, reacted with a single, lightning-fast motion. He drew his knife, slashed through the canvas, and burst into the surrounding rocks before the soldiers could close in. His family members were not so fortunate. They were seized and bound, becoming prisoners taken on a false accusation, trapped by a young officer's inflexible certainty. Cochise responded immediately, capturing Americans who were passing through the pass, stage line employees he had previously allowed to travel unharmed. He then sent a clear message to Bascom. "Exchange prisoners. Release my family and I release yours." It was a direct, practical proposition, a clear way out of the escalating crisis. Bascom, however, refused. He adamantly demanded the boy. Cochise, understandably, could not produce a child taken by men he did not command. The standoff hardened into something far colder and more dangerous. Over the ensuing days, the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. More hostages were taken on both sides. Communication narrowed into an exchange of grim threats. Cochise, in an act of strategic restraint, released the American woman he held, a gesture intended to keep negotiation alive. Bascom, tragically, misinterpreted it as weakness. He dug in deeper, convinced that any flexibility on his part would merely embarrass American authority. On February 18th, Cochise killed his American hostages in full view of the army camp. This was not a mindless act of slaughter, it was a stark declaration. The rules had fundamentally changed. If Americans were willing to seize Apache families based on lies, then Americans moving through Apache country would no longer be protected by any old expectations of safety. Bascom retaliated by hanging Cochise's brother and nephews, not a clean military execution, but a barbaric act of vengeance. Their bodies were deliberately left suspended where Cochise would inevitably find them, a profound violation of Apache burial customs and a message chillingly written in cruelty. The Bascom Affair irrevocably shattered the remaining illusion of coexistence. Cochise had arrived willing to negotiate, willing to leverage his influence to resolve a crisis not of his making. He departed with family members brutally murdered because a lieutenant could not bring himself to admit he might be wrong. The lesson was simple and brutal: American authority could not be trusted. Diplomatic contact could become a deadly trap. And if violence was the only language they understood and would enforce, then Cochise would respond in the only way that could keep his people alive. Within weeks, stage stations in his territory were consumed by flames. Ranchers, miners, and travelers became immediate targets. Trails that had previously been relatively safe transformed into corridors of sudden death. The few Americans who had genuinely maintained decent relationships with the Apache either fled or were brutally swallowed by this grim new reality. There was no longer any room for neutrals, not once families had been taken and bodies left to swing in the wind. The United States was about to learn firsthand what it truly meant to fight an enemy who knew every canyon, every hidden spring, every secret route across 1,000 square miles of unforgiving ground. And they were about to learn that Cochise was not a problem that could simply be solved with more men or superior firearms. He was a war without a battlefield, a conflict that would relentlessly drain resources, lives, and reputations for more than a decade. The desert was about to become a formidable weapon, and Cochise was the unwavering hand that would wield it. The war began without any formal declaration. It commenced with a pervasive silence. Stage stations ceased reporting. Supply wagons mysteriously vanished between forts. Ranchers abandoned their homesteads under the cloak of darkness, leaving doors ajar and meals untouched. The corridors that had confidently carried American expansion into the Southwest suddenly became lethally dangerous. Cochise did not engage in combat in the manner American officers anticipated. There were no mass formations, no clear battlefields where superior firepower could decisively settle the outcome. There were only ghosts, warriors seemingly appearing from rocks too small to conceal a man, attacks arriving simultaneously from multiple directions, then dissolving into the landscape before soldiers could even form a defensive line. The ambushes were executed with surgical precision. Cochise meticulously observed American movements with the intensity of a seasoned hunter tracking game. When wagons departed, which routes they typically favored, where their speed inevitably slowed, and where escorts would find it difficult to maneuver. He strategically positioned his men in narrow passages where wagon wheels had to painstakingly crawl and rifles could not be freely swung. The land, in its harsh beauty, took care of the rest. The attacks typically lasted mere minutes. By the time reinforcements finally arrived, there was nothing left to fight, only burned cargo and bodies slowly cooling in the desert dust. Sometimes, travelers simply vanished without a trace. A party would depart Tucson heading east and never reach its destination. Search teams found absolutely nothing that offered any semblance of an answer. No bodies, no discernible tracks, no evidence that could be rationally explained in an official report. The gnawing uncertainty was often far worse than confirmed deaths. It signified that nowhere was truly safe. It implied that the Apache could strike with devastating effect and then leave behind no trace worth pursuing. The psychological impact struck first and lingered the longest. Soldiers at remote outposts lived under a permanent, suffocating tension. Every shifting shadow could conceal a rifleman. Every distant ridge line could hold unseen eyes. Men stopped sleeping soundly. They fired impulsively at sounds that often proved to be merely wind or foraging animals. Weeks of constant, draining readiness wore them down far more rapidly than actual combat. Cochise deliberately made supply lines the absolute center of his war strategy. He understood a fundamental truth that armies sometimes forgot: power moves on food, water, ammunition, and time. Destroy enough wagons, and forts would begin to starve. Make routes dangerous enough, and civilian contractors would refuse the work at any price. He was not attempting to defeat the army in a direct battle. He was systematically rendering their presence impossible to sustain. The mountains became his intricate infrastructure. The Dragoon Mountains, the Chiricahua Mountains, these ranges were not merely terrain, they were meticulously understood systems. Cochise knew canyons capable of concealing an entire band, even as pursuers rode past within yards. He knew hidden springs tucked into rock formations that appeared dry and lifeless. He knew trails that seemingly ended at an impenetrable wall, only to thread into complex networks known exclusively to the Apache. When army columns pursued him, they entered a landscape that actively fought back. Water was agonizingly scarce and easily defensible. The brutal summer heat killed men and horses without a single shot being fired. Rocky ground often left no discernible track for a soldier to read, and every mile forward stretched their already thin supply lines even further, while bringing them no closer to a visible target they could actually engage. Cochise's strongholds were invisible to outsiders. He utilized strategic positions in the dragoons with narrow, easily defensible approaches that could be held by a mere handful of men, elevated ground that offered panoramic views for miles, and escape routes that plunged deeper into the stone, where cavalry could not possibly follow. These were not permanent camps waiting to be discovered. His people moved constantly, rotating through dozens of locations, never staying long enough to be pinned down. The army responded with the tools it understood: more forts, larger patrols, and scouts hired from other tribes. None of it truly solved the intractable problem. Cochise had been raised within this country. He could move 100 people through terrain that soldiers considered impossible. He could locate water where army maps stubbornly insisted there was none. He could interpret weather patterns and judge distances in ways that paper could never teach. His warriors fought only on their own terms. If soldiers occupied superior ground, Cochise simply did not attack, he vanished. If the odds shifted even slightly against him, he withdrew. He meticulously preserved his fighters because every lost Apache warrior represented an irreplaceable hole that could not be refilled, whereas the army could endlessly replace its men. This was not fear, it was cold, hard arithmetic. The disappearing act became its own form of terror. Soldiers would chase a band into a canyon and emerge on the other side with no sign of them. To the untrained eye, it seemed as if the Apache had literally dissolved into the rock walls. In reality, they utilized routes that demanded intimate, lifelong knowledge, narrow breaks, hidden caves, and climbs that appeared impossible until one remembered they had been practiced since childhood. Officers filed reports that often read like nightmares, tracks that simply ended, campsites still warm but abandoned without a trace, the unsettling sensation of being watched from unseen positions, creating a certainty of being surrounded without anything concrete to point to. When asked where the threat was, that, precisely, was the point. Cochise profoundly understood that fear could achieve what bullets could not. If soldiers constantly anticipated an ambush around every bend, they would begin to perceive danger even when it was not there. Fear degraded judgment, produced costly mistakes, and made men clumsy, loud, and impatient, precisely what the desert punished, and exactly what the Apache patiently waited for. For the army, it was a form of maddening frustration. They possessed superior numbers, better weapons, and resources that the Apache could never hope to match. Yet, those advantages meant absolutely nothing when they could not be brought to bear. They could not fight an enemy they could not find. They could not win battles that never materialized into conventional engagements. Careers died in the Arizona Territory. Officers who had proven their capabilities elsewhere found their reputations irrevocably ruined by their utter failure to defeat a few hundred determined warriors. Promotions stalled, and requests for transfer multiplied. Fighting organized armies had been brutal but comprehensible. Fighting Cochise was like attempting to strike smoke. Civilians panicked. Mines shut down, ranches emptied. The territorial government sent increasingly desperate requests to Washington for more troops, new strategies, anything that might work. But the Civil War consumed national attention and resources. Arizona was supposed to be manageable. It emphatically was not. Cochise maintained steady pressure. He did not require a decisive victory. He needed a relentless lesson to accumulate. Every dead soldier, every burned wagon, every abandoned settlement added another unbearable cost to the ledger. He wanted the Americans to feel, day after agonizing day, that holding this territory would demand far more than it could ever possibly repay. By 1863, the war had settled into a grim stalemate that distinctly favored the Apache. The army held its forts, but it certainly did not control the vast land between them. Civilian presence shrank back to a few heavily defended towns. The routes that had once symbolized American expansion became virtual graveyards for anyone who dared to travel without a heavy escort. Commanders desperately tried new approaches. They spoke of negotiation. They offered amnesty if Cochise would accept reservation confinement. They attempted to turn other bands against him. They dispatched emissaries with a mixture of promises and threats. Cochise, however, ignored it all. He had learned the harsh truth at Apache Pass. American promises could become deadly traps. Treaties were merely paper, useful only until they weren't. The only thing that truly mattered was capability. And he had irrefutably proven that the United States Army, for all its immense power, could not control land that a few hundred Apache had made hostile. The desert had become an active weapon. The mountains had transformed into impenetrable fortresses. And Cochise had become something the army had no doctrine for, not a chief to confront, not a rebellion to crush, but a profound condition to be endured. And that endurance, for the Empire, was only just beginning. The army euphemistically termed them punitive expeditions, large-scale operations intended to locate Cochise's strongholds, cripple his capacity to fight, and force his ultimate submission. Columns numbering in the hundreds pushed deep into the mountains with guides, weeks of supplies, and explicit orders to return with tangible results. Most, however, returned with nothing but severe sunburn, dead horses, and the haunting memory of empty campsites in a country that stubbornly resisted their every step. In 1862, General James Carleton took command of operations in the Southwest. A seasoned veteran of multiple campaigns, he arrived utterly convinced that his proven methods would succeed once more. He ordered expeditions into the Chiricahua and Dragoon Mountains with a simple, direct instruction: pursue without rest, destroy Apache supplies, make it impossible for them to hunt or sleep in peace. This monumental effort consumed enormous resources, yet produced almost nothing that yielded lasting results. The fundamental problem was both simple and utterly unsolvable. When army columns ventured into the mountains, Apache scouts spotted them from miles away. By the time soldiers finally reached suspected campgrounds, the people were long gone, not in panicked flight, but in carefully planned withdrawals to alternate positions. They left no stores for the army to burn, no permanent shelters to demolish, nothing that could not be easily carried off or swiftly replaced. The military had been rigorously trained to destroy fixed targets. Cochise provided them with none. Failures accumulated until the very word, success, began to lose all meaning. Expeditions reported hollow victories because they had merely found abandoned camps. Officers claimed engagements where warriors had supposedly been killed, only for the fights to dissolve into minor skirmishes with no confirmed casualties. The chasm between official reports and the harsh reality on the ground widened as commanders desperately tried to justify costs and efforts that yielded no measurable outcome. That cost was escalating dramatically in every conceivable direction. Each expedition required significant allocations of food, ammunition, horses, repairs, and paid guides. Each venture into hostile territory transformed into a hungry machine that demanded constant resupply. Everything had to be meticulously escorted: mail, payroll, provisions. Each wagon became a moving target, and each escort represented yet another substantial expense. The Arizona Territory ceased to resemble a promising frontier ripe for development, and instead began to look like an insatiable drain that produced nothing but casualty lists and relentless requests for more money. Civilians lived under the oppressive weight of the war's pervasive uncertainty. Ranchers who chose to remain armed themselves like small garrisons, fortifying their homes and adamantly refusing to travel alone. Mining ventures that had once promised immense wealth bled into insolvency under the crushing cost of guards and escorts. Some men simply departed, abandoning claims and equipment they could no longer defend. Towns became isolated islands of American presence within a hostile, churning sea. Tucson, Tubac, and a handful of other settlements survived through constant vigilance and the protective umbrella of nearby garrisons. Travel between them necessitated armed escorts that were not always available. Mail arrived late, or often not at all. Commerce slowed to a mere fraction of what it had been before the war solidified into routine. Apache raids systematically widened beyond purely military targets. Cochise deftly coordinated pressure across a broad landscape, striking ranches, mines, and travelers in unpredictable patterns that consistently kept the Americans off balance. A raid in one region would draw soldiers northward, then attacks would flare up elsewhere. Wagons were hit on routes previously believed to be secure. Defenses were constructed around last month's threat, while the next one inevitably emerged from a different, unexpected direction. Unpredictability became a potent weapon. Across the border, Mexican villages suffered just as they always had. Cochise raided on both sides, taking horses, cattle, and supplies from settlements that had been targets for generations. The arbitrary boundary meant absolutely nothing to a people who did not recognize its authority over their ancient homeland. Mexican officials lodged protests with American authorities, but the Americans could do little more than file these complaints alongside their own mounting grievances. Political pressure intensified. Territorial newspapers published scathing editorials decrying military incompetence. Citizens vociferously demanded protection that their government could not reliably provide. In Washington, letters poured in from settlers who had ventured west seeking opportunity, and instead found only pervasive fear. The Civil War still dominated national attention, but the Apache War was steadily becoming a profound humiliation that stubbornly refused to remain a local issue. Cochise's name spread far beyond the Southwest. Eastern newspapers printed sensationalized accounts, often inaccurate, yet always useful for boosting sales. He was variously portrayed as a ruthless savage, a brilliant strategist, or an elusive ghost impossible to capture. Some stories even drifted into mythology, claiming he could vanish into thin air, that bullets passed harmlessly through him, or that he commanded powers beyond human explanation. The truth, however, was far more unsettling for the army precisely because it required no superstition. Cochise was winning through superior knowledge, unwavering discipline, and a clear, pragmatic understanding of the true nature of this war. He did not need to utterly destroy the army. He merely needed to render their presence unsustainable. Every month without a resolution was a victory. Every expedition that returned empty-handed was further proof that the Americans could occupy their forts, but they could not truly control the country between them. Commanders rotated through Arizona, each arriving with fresh confidence and a new plan. Each, in turn, eventually produced reports explaining why this particular enemy required vastly different tactics: more men, more time, more money. The justifications changed, but the ultimate outcome did not. Cochise kept operating with devastating effectiveness. American control extended only as far as a rifle could reach, and even that tenuous control evaporated the moment the soldiers marched away. The war settled into a grim routine. Soldiers grudgingly accepted they were stationed in hostile territory where attacks could erupt at any moment. Civilians adjusted to lives narrowed and constrained by constant danger. The economy adapted to the harsh truth that certain routes and certain ventures were simply too costly to maintain. What had initially begun as an urgent crisis became a permanent condition. Some officers began to cautiously argue for alternatives. Perhaps negotiation was, in fact, possible. Perhaps some arrangement could end the bloodshed without the pretense that the Apache could be entirely erased. Perhaps total victory was an unachievable fantasy, and some form of coexistence simply had to be painfully rebuilt. But these dissenting voices were quickly smothered by relentless demands for complete subjugation. In official policy, there was absolutely no room for an independent indigenous existence within land now claimed as American. The Apache would either be confined, disarmed, made dependent, or they would be utterly destroyed. Any middle ground was discussed only in private and vehemently denied in public. For Cochise, the war became precisely what he needed it to be: unwinnable for the Americans, yet sustainable for the Apache. His people suffered, no question. The relentless pressure narrowed their movements, thinned their resources, and pursuit was constant. But they remained free, still mobile, still capable of defiantly refusing the outcome an empire assumed was inevitable. Years passed. The Civil War finally ended, and more resources consequently became available for Western campaigns. New commanders arrived, confidently promising that with proper support, they could at last crush Cochise. More troops arrived, along with better weapons, better trained scouts drawn from other tribes, and significantly larger budgets. Yet, none of it fundamentally changed the equation. The army was fighting an enemy who could not be forced into a decisive battle, who understood the terrain in ways the soldiers were still painstakingly learning, and who had everything to lose, and therefore fought with a desperation that no bureaucracy could ever hope to replicate. By 1870, nearly a decade into the conflict, the official language began to shift. Reports ceased promising imminent victory. Officers spoke instead of containment, limiting depredations, protecting key routes, and defending a few settlements. The dream of total victory did not die dramatically, it simply faded into mundane administrative vocabulary. But containment meant a constant, costly military presence. Constant presence meant endless expense. And as long as Cochise remained free, the illusion of American control over the Southwest remained starkly exposed for what it was: a mere illusion. The crucial question facing military and political leaders was no longer how to defeat Cochise. It was how long they were willing to sustain a war that consumed vast resources and produced no decisive end. And Cochise, watching from the familiar mountains he had known since childhood, profoundly understood that time ultimately belonged to the people who could endure. Every month the Americans spent chasing shadows was another month his people remained unbroken. Every frustrated expedition was another confirmation that some territories cannot be conquered, only suffered through. The war would continue. But victory, for either side, was becoming a word that held no clear meaning in the relentless desert heat and the deep mountain shadows of the Southwest. By 1871, the war had consumed more than a decade. An entire generation of soldiers had rotated through the Arizona Territory, most departing without ever truly seeing the elusive enemy they were sent to defeat. Officers arrived with ambition and boundless confidence, only to depart with ruined careers and the hard-won understanding that some victories simply could not be forced into existence by conventional means. Commanders came and went in a relentless procession. General Carleton was replaced by General Irvin McDowell, who in turn gave way to General George Stoneman. Each arrived with renewed confidence, fresh theories, and new explanations for why the last man had failed. Yet, each eventually authored reports that echoed the same profound sense of defeat. The terrain was merciless, Apache tactics proved superior to any pursuit, and the resources required to achieve definitive success were always just beyond what anyone was willing to commit. New strategies continuously arose, only to collapse under the scorching sun. One commander proposed an elaborate line of forts so tightly spaced that Apache movement would theoretically be strangled between them. The forts were built at enormous cost, but then the Apache simply went around them, utilizing passes the soldiers did not even know existed. Garrisons sat isolated behind timber and earth, controlling a mere few hundred yards of ground, while Cochise moved freely through millions of acres that no patrol could truly cover. Another plan focused on water: occupy springs, hold river crossings, control the desert by controlling what sustained human life. In theory, it was sound. In practice, it was often fatal. The Apache knew water sources the army had never mapped: hidden springs in rock crevices, seasonal flows that appeared only after heavy rain, ancient cisterns that held enough to last. Army columns staggered through the heat and dust, many dying of thirst while pursuing enemies who seemed to require no water at all. Capturing Cochise became a desperate obsession. His name drew significant attention, money, and fervent, often futile, hope. Scouts from other tribes were promised substantial rewards for information leading to his capture. Rumors arrived daily, some confident, most utterly worthless. Expeditions marched on tips that were either false or true but already outdated. Cochise had indeed been there, yes, but days before the soldiers arrived, leaving them to stare at silent stone and wonder how a man could always remain just out of their reach. Deception entered the war as naturally as gunfire. Apache groups periodically appeared at forts, claiming peace, asking for rations and protection. Some were genuinely desperate families, worn down by years of constant flight. Others were sophisticated intelligence operations. While soldiers counted heads and handed out food, these visitors quietly observed fort layouts, guard routines, supply levels, and officer habits. Then they would depart, and that vital knowledge would flow back into the mountains. One deception was so audacious it left an entire garrison profoundly humiliated. An Apache group surrendered, lived on a reservation for months, and then vanished, taking every supply they could carry. By the time the army understood what had truly happened, they were back in the mountains, rejoined with Cochise. The incident proved a cruel truth: even apparent victories could be masterful feats of strategy when the enemy measured time and objectives differently. The pursuit cycle became endless, almost ritualistic. Reports of raids would arrive. Columns would march toward the reported location. They would arrive to find tantalizing signs of recent presence: ashes, tracks, trampled brush, but no Apache. They followed trails that mysteriously dissolved on rock or split into multiple directions, like deliberate misdirection. Days were spent in fruitless searching. Men and horses wore down under the relentless conditions. Then the column would return to base, having achieved nothing except exhaustion. Some officers began to grimly understand why they could not win. They were fighting people who had been raised within this very environment, people who read the land with the same innate understanding that soldiers used to read maps. People who needed no cumbersome supply trains because they carried what mattered or knew precisely where to find it. The Apache were not a foreign force that could be defeated and sent away. They were home. And removing them required a kind of war the army could not conduct without becoming something it refused to name. Even when soldiers did manage to locate camps, engagements rarely delivered decisive results. Warriors fought briefly, just long enough for families to withdraw to safety, then expertly pulled away into ground that could not be pursued. Soldiers would overrun empty camps, burn what little remained, and dutifully write reports of victory. The Apache, meanwhile, would establish new camps 20 miles away and resume operations as if nothing significant had occurred. Cochise's leadership did not fracture. While other leaders were killed or captured, and some bands eventually surrendered when desperation became too acute, Cochise himself remained free. And as long as he did, the war inexorably continued. His mere existence mocked American authority. It was undeniable proof that the government could not enforce its will on the very territories it claimed to control. The strain on Apache society was severe. Constant movement erased the normal rhythms of life. Children grew up without stability. Ceremonies were disrupted. Sacred places became too dangerous to approach. Diets narrowed to what could be hunted quickly or taken in raids. Captured Apache showed the toll in their bodies, gaunt faces, exhaustion deeply carved into bone. Yet they endured. Cochise kept his people together through disciplined judgment and sheer force of will. He chose battles carefully, meticulously preserving his fighters, and maintained just enough pressure to keep the American presence costly, while skillfully avoiding the kind of disaster that could utterly break their resistance. By 1872, 11 years into the war, even the most confident officers stopped predicting imminent victory. The language shifted to containment, to management. The goal was no longer to defeat Cochise, but simply to limit him, protect key settlements, keep vital routes barely functioning, and maintain enough military presence to prevent open collapse. Washington took notice. Investigators were dispatched to understand why the campaign continued to devour resources without producing any end. They toured forts, interviewed officers, and meticulously examined reports. Their conclusions were deeply uncomfortable. The Apache were too mobile, the terrain too punishing, and the cost of total victory simply too high for anyone to justify paying. They recommended negotiation. But negotiating with Cochise seemed impossible. He had been brutally betrayed at Apache Pass. He had watched family members hang because a lieutenant chose stubborn certainty over inconvenient truth. He had spent more than a decade fiercely resisting American expansion with every fiber of his being. Why would he ever trust offers from the same authority that had hunted him without pause or mercy? Some argued for immediate escalation, more troops, harsher tactics, a total war that erased any distinction between warrior and family. Starve them out, kill their horses, burn what they own, force a choice between submission and death. Others understood the terrifying implications of such an approach. It would be morally repugnant and practically dangerous. The Apache could simply scatter into even smaller, harder-to-track groups. Total war would inevitably create martyrs and harden resistance rather than effectively breaking it. The prolonged stalemate unequivocally demanded a political solution, not another military fantasy. As 1872 transitioned into 1873, nothing fundamentally changed on the ground. Cochise held his mountains. The army held its forts. Everything in between remained contested space where violence could erupt without warning. Settlers stopped coming. Investment dried up. The territory lived inside a permanent, low-intensity war that benefited no one and could not be ended by sheer force. Something had to shift. The costs were simply too high, the rewards too thin, and the embarrassment too visible. But genuine change required the rarest figure on the frontier, someone willing to negotiate in good faith. Someone Cochise might actually listen to. Someone who understood that merely demanding surrender would only prolong the grinding war. That person was about to arrive in Arizona. His name was Tom Jeffords. And he was going to attempt what every commander had declared impossible, to meet Cochise as an equal, not as a target. What happened next would ultimately prove that some wars conclude not with a clear victory, but with a hard-won recognition. Tom Jeffords was not a soldier. He was a mail superintendent, responsible for maintaining open communication routes through Apache territory, a job that had become almost impossible. His riders were dying with such regularity that the entire service was collapsing. He needed to solve the problem that the army could not, how to move safely through Cochise's country without being relentlessly hunted. So Jeffords did what no army officer had even considered. He rode alone and unarmed into Apache territory, seeking to speak with Cochise directly. Not to demand surrender, not to threaten, but simply to talk. He kept his weapons visible but undrawn. He made no attempt to hide his approach. In his mind, he was either going to reach Cochise or die trying. Either outcome would resolve his immediate problem. Apache scouts spotted him immediately. They watched this lone white man riding deliberately toward ground where Cochise's people operated. They could have easily killed him without effort. Instead, they brought him in, partly out of sheer curiosity, and partly out of a profound respect for a display of courage that bordered on madness. The meeting, by all conventional logic, should have failed. Cochise had every conceivable reason to kill Jeffords, or at the very least, drive him away with a stern warning. Instead, something utterly unexpected occurred. They talked not through official interpreters with their own hidden agendas, but directly, using the broken blend of Apache, Spanish, and English that frontier life demanded. Jeffords did not project an authority he did not possess. He offered no promises he could not reliably keep. He asked for one thing: safe passage for his mail riders. In return, he offered only his word that they would carry mail, not military intelligence. Cochise agreed, not because he suddenly trusted the United States government, but because he recognized something authentic and real in the man before him. Here was someone who came alone, who showed genuine respect without demanding it, who understood that true negotiation required offering something tangible, not simply issuing empty threats. Soon, mail riders began crossing Apache territory untouched, a thin, improbable strip of peace running through a landscape of war. Over the ensuing months, that tentative understanding deepened. Jeffords regularly visited Cochise's camps. They shared meals, spoke candidly about the ongoing war, the tightening pressure on both sides, and whether a true end was even remotely possible. Jeffords did not pretend to speak for the government. He had no official authority. But he listened. And in a war where no one truly listened to the Apache perspective, that alone carried immense weight. By 1872, the urgent need for a settlement was pressing from every direction. The relentless conflict drained money and manpower. Civilian deaths continued unabated. The territorial economy was being systematically strangled. And in Washington, official patience was rapidly thinning. A new figure was dispatched west with explicit orders to negotiate: General Oliver Otis Howard, a Civil War veteran known for his strong moral conviction and a firm belief that peaceful terms were still attainable. Howard was unlike the commanders who had preceded him. He believed that genuine coexistence could be forged. He believed indigenous people deserved fair treatment, and he was willing to offer terms that others would have summarily rejected as weakness. When he arrived in Arizona and inquired who could lead him to Cochise, the answer came swiftly and unequivocally: Tom Jeffords. In September 1872, Jeffords led Howard deep into the formidable Dragoon Mountains. It was an act of profound faith on both sides, Howard trusting Jeffords not to lead him to his death, and Cochise trusting Jeffords enough to even meet with a general. The meeting took place where Cochise felt most secure, inside his own stronghold, surrounded by his loyal warriors, on ground where any act of betrayal could be instantly and decisively answered. The negotiations lasted an extraordinary 11 days. It was no brief conference in a fortified camp, but extended, substantive conversations where each side meticulously laid out its reality. Howard offered a reservation within the Chiricahua Mountains, Cochise's own ancestral homeland, the very country where he had been born. Cochise and his people could remain there. There would be no forced relocation to distant, unfamiliar territories, no confinement alongside bands they did not recognize. They could keep their weapons. They could maintain their traditional way of life within the established reservation boundaries. The terms were almost unprecedented. Other Apache groups had been forcibly pushed far from their homelands, disarmed, and made entirely dependent. Howard offered something that did not feel like a cage, land that was truly Apache land, with enough autonomy that it could plausibly pass for dignity. Cochise, in turn, presented his own conditions. Tom Jeffords would serve as the Indian agent, the government representative on the reservation, not a political appointee, not a soldier, but someone Cochise personally trusted. The government would not interfere in internal Apache matters. No missionaries would be imposed, no demands that Apache life be reshaped into an American mold, and most importantly, no troops would be stationed on the reservation itself. Howard agreed. He exceeded what he was strictly authorized to promise, but he firmly believed that lasting peace was well worth the inherent risk. On October 12, 1872, Cochise and Howard formally shook hands. The war concluded not through military conquest, but through a mutual recognition that neither side could deny. Continuing the conflict served no one. And for a time, the agreed-upon terms held firm. Troops withdrew from the Chiricahua Mountains. The reservation was established over traditional Apache territory. Jeffords assumed his post and enforced little beyond the agreement itself, largely allowing the Apache to govern their own lives. Raids ceased. Travelers once again began using routes through the region without the constant need for heavy escort. It was not complete freedom. Cochise understood that with stark clarity. His people now lived inside boundaries drawn by outsiders. The old life of unrestricted movement was undeniably ending. But it was a peace achieved without humiliation, a survival secured without absolute surrender. These were the best possible terms available in a world that had already irrevocably shifted beneath their feet. Many Americans fiercely hated the agreement. Officers who had spent years relentlessly hunting Cochise viewed the settlement as a reward for resistance. Settlers complained bitterly that a man accused of killing Americans was being allowed to live freely on his own land rather than dying on a rope. Politicians warned that negotiating with hostiles would only invite more defiance. Yet the war had stopped. Costs dramatically dropped. Travel resumed. Settlement pushed forward again. However bitter the criticism, the tangible, practical results spoke far louder than any outraged condemnation. Cochise spent his remaining years on the reservation, meticulously maintaining the peace he had negotiated, but never truly accepting American authority as legitimate. He honored the agreement because it served his people, not because he had been conquered. When he met with government officials, he did so as a man dictating terms, not as a subordinate receiving orders. His health steadily declined. Years of relentless war, pervasive hunger, and constant strain had taken a profound toll on him. By 1874, he was visibly weakening. He named his son Taza as his successor, acutely aware that the next generation would confront pressures he could barely measure. The world that had shaped him was rapidly disappearing, relentlessly replaced by railroads, fences, and a tide of settlement that would not retreat. On June 8, 1874, Cochise died, not in battle, not in prison, but in his own country, surrounded by his people, having secured the only peace he could accept, one that preserved Apache dignity and autonomy within the progressively narrowing space that history allowed. They buried him in the Dragoon Mountains, in a place they never revealed. No marker, no monument, no grave a stranger could ever stand over. Just rock, sky, and the profound land that had defined his entire life. The peace lasted as long as Jeffords remained agent and Cochise's authority held sway. But empires do not typically honor agreements made with dead men, and the forces Cochise had held back through sheer will and formidable reputation were already gathering strength once more. The question facing the Chiricahua was no longer whether they could maintain the peace Cochise had negotiated. It was whether that peace had ever been anything more than a temporary pause, brief, fragile, and ultimately doomed before the inexorable process resumed: confinement, disarmament, suppression, and the slow, agonizing removal of a people from their own future. Cochise had bought time. Whether that time was truly worth the immense cost was a question his people would be forced to live with for generations. History often seeks to label Cochise a warrior chief, but this conventional label utterly misses what truly made him exceptional. Warriors fight battles. Cochise, instead, engineered a strategic system where battles became largely irrelevant. He did not defeat the United States Army through superior combat. He defeated it by rendering victory impossible to define, impossible to reach, and impossible to conclusively finish. He was an architect of war in the purest, most profound sense. He understood that warfare is not merely about killing, it is about the masterful manipulation of space, time, resources, and psychology to force a desired outcome. His objective was never to destroy American power, that was an unattainable goal. His objective was to make the cost of occupying Apache country far exceed any conceivable benefit that occupation could ever return. Every ambush, every burned wagon, every patrol that marched out and returned empty-handed, each contributed to a growing ledger until continuation became utterly indefensible. His strategy was profoundly territorial in a way American commanders struggled to comprehend. Cochise was not defending fixed positions that could be captured and photographed as proof. He was actively turning the territory itself into a hostile entity. Mountains, deserts, and canyons became extensions of their resistance. Water became a critical tactical asset. Escape routes transformed into an intricate infrastructure. The land was not something to be held like a fort. It was something to be weaponized against anyone who did not intimately belong to it. This demanded an understanding of topography as far more than mere lines on a map. Cochise also grasped the profound emotional impact of the landscape on his enemies. Soldiers from eastern cities found the desert psychologically crushing: endless distances, brutal heat, scarce water, and a horizon that offered no mercy and no familiar landmarks they could trust. The terrain was not simply difficult, it was alien. That alienness wore down morale as effectively as any bullets. He led through sheer competence, not ceremonial authority. Apache society had no kings. Leadership was inherently situational. The best hunter led hunts, the most skilled warrior led raids, the wisest voice guided disputes. Cochise's authority grew organically from decisions that consistently kept his people alive and unbroken, while other bands were being relentlessly driven toward confinement. Men followed him because his judgment held steadfast under extreme pressure, not because a title commanded obedience. This decentralization profoundly frustrated the Americans. They desperately wanted a single leader they could capture or kill to summarily end the war. But Cochise's genius lay not only in his personal survival, it was in his extraordinary ability to coordinate. Without rigid command structures, even if he had been removed, resistance would not have ended cleanly. It would have fragmented into smaller, sharper, even more elusive operations, harder to predict and far harder to suppress. He practiced a form of denial warfare, not denying land by physically occupying it, but denying the enemy the fundamental ability to effectively use it. Americans could march through Apache country. They could plant flags. They could build forts. But they could not safely settle. They could not keep supply lines intact. They could not enforce sovereignty beyond rifle range from their isolated garrisons. Cochise transformed vast stretches of territory into zones where American authority existed solely on paper. This strategy worked because he brilliantly exploited the asymmetry at the heart of the conflict. The army required elaborate logistics: wagons, schedules, communications, reinforcements, medical support. The Apache, by contrast, required almost nothing that the land did not already abundantly provide. The army measured success in battles won and ground held. Cochise measured success in enemy exhaustion, empty marches, broken morale, steadily rising costs, and the slow, dawning realization that sheer force could not produce the decisive result Washington demanded. He represented a stark limit to imperial power, a truth empires rarely admit. The United States could defeat conventional armies, occupy cities, govern farmland, and impose law on settled populations, but it could not easily pacify mobile people in terrain that inherently resisted pacification. The Apache demonstrated that some places simply cannot be held by force alone. To truly take them, the land itself has to be fundamentally transformed, settled densely enough to leave no space for resistance, controlled so completely that mobility becomes utterly impossible. That profound transformation would eventually come. Railroads would bring settlers in numbers the frontier could not possibly absorb. Towns would multiply. Farming, mining, and extensive development would irreversibly alter the country until it no longer supported the kind of fluid movement Apache life depended upon. But during Cochise's lifetime, that relentless process was incomplete. And in the critical gap between American ambition and American capability, he operated with devastating effectiveness. Cochise understood that the world he defended could not continue unchanged. The open ranges were being relentlessly fenced. Territory was being carved smaller year by agonizing year. The future pressed inexorably toward reservations, dependency, and profound cultural erosion. But recognizing the inevitable does not necessitate accepting it quietly. He fought not because he believed he could halt American expansion forever, but because some things are inherently worth resisting, even when ultimate victory is not a realistic promise. His peace was not surrender, it was extraction, maximum terms pulled from a position of unexpected strength. He ended the war not because he was broken, but because continuing it no longer effectively served his people. The reservation he accepted was on his own land, with his own people, under minimal external control. It was a narrow outcome in a rapidly narrowing world, yet it was profound proof that resistance, even without ultimate triumph, could force far better terms than submission ever would. What Cochise truly represents is a powerful warning about the inherent limits of military power. Empires delude themselves into believing that superior technology and boundless resources guarantee victory. But wars are not fought in abstraction. They are fought in specific places against people with specific knowledge and motivations. When knowledge is deep enough, when motivation is existential enough, when terrain profoundly favors those who know it intimately, conventional advantages begin to dissolve. The United States learned that lesson, albeit imperfectly. The Apache were eventually contained through systematic settlement and resource control, not by a decisive battlefield defeat. This principle echoes far beyond the Southwest. You cannot easily defeat people who know the land better than you do, who need less than you need, and who have far more to lose than you have to gain. Cochise never became a figure Americans could comfortably celebrate. There are no national holidays in his honor, no town squares adorned with his statues, no national narrative that transforms him into a harmless legend. He remains an uncomfortable figure precisely because he resisted long enough to dictate terms, because he forced an empire to briefly acknowledge that it could not simply take what it wanted by brute force. His legacy endures as a collection of unsettling questions rather than simple answers. If one leader with a mere few hundred followers could stalemate the United States Army for more than a decade, what does that truly say about the fundamental nature of power? If the most technologically equipped military force of its era could not impose its will in a landscape it did not understand, what does that reveal about the inherent limits of technology? If negotiation ultimately achieved what years of relentless pursuit could not, what does that suggest about when to fight and when to speak? Those questions unsettled Army officers in 1874. They continue to unsettle leaders even now, because the answers challenge the foundational myths empires depend on. The inevitability of progress, the certainty of control, the arrogant assumption that one civilization has the inherent right to claim and reshape any place it chooses. Cochise proved that primitive was a label that revealed far more about the one using it than about the people it purported to describe. His strategic sophistication outpaced that of trained officers. His tactical adaptability exceeded established doctrine. His profound understanding of terrain as a weapons system was more advanced than the Army's own imagination. The only thing primitive about the Apache was their technology, and in the country where they fought, that technology was perfectly matched to the environment, while American advantages often proved unusable. He died having achieved something truly rare. He compelled an empire to negotiate on terms approaching equality, not because the empire desired it, but because victory had become far too expensive to purchase. That is strategic success in its most brutal form, making the enemy's victory cost more than they can possibly justify paying. And the peace did not ultimately survive him. After his death, the agreements he had so painstakingly secured were steadily violated, then summarily discarded. The Chiricahua were eventually removed and scattered. Promises made in good faith were broken by those who felt no obligation to honor deals made with a man no longer alive. But for a brief, vital moment in history, Cochise demonstrated that resistance could indeed force terms, that war could be fought asymmetrically with devastating effect, and that empires possess limits they profoundly prefer not to name. The moment passed. The machinery of expansion moved inexorably forward. But the questions he left behind, about power, resistance, and the true cost of empire, remain unresolved in ways that should trouble anyone who believes that superiority guarantees outcomes. Cochise did not win a war, he prevented one. He did not conquer territory, he made it unusable. For more than a decade, the United States Army marched, built forts, and sent columns into the desert, only to return having achieved nothing permanent. Cochise did not defeat an empire. He taught it that some wars do not end, they exhaust. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to Fragments of History and leave a like so these documentaries can reach more people. And in the comments, which resistance leader should we explore next?